It's Monday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me today, Chairman of the 1922 Committee of Conservative MPs, Sir Graham Brady, Shadow Social Care Minister Liz Kendall, journalist and broadcaster Nadine Batchelor-Hunt and Daily Telegraph columnist Tim Stanley. Today, it turns out this apology wasn't enough.
I was at a pretty low point in my life and obviously I regret that massively.
England cricketer Ollie Robinson is suspended for racist and sexist tweets he posted as an 18-year-old. The Culture Secretary says it's the wrong decision. Will lifting the remaining COVID restrictions on the 21st be delayed? Boris Johnson has just 7 days to decide.
We're absolutely open to doing that if that's what it needs to happen.
Tory backbenchers are cross about foreign aid cuts, but will they get a chance to rebel?
You've just got to have a very close look at the damage that you're doing. If you are going to kill people with this, which I think is going to be the outcome in many areas, we need to reverse those immediately.
Let's start with one of the stories we talked about in the headlines, and that is that England bowler Ollie Robinson has been suspended from international cricket while some of his tweets are investigated. Now, the tweets are from several years ago, nearly a decade, and as we heard a moment ago, Ollie Robinson has been suspended and apologised for them. Now, the Culture Secretary, rather unusually, Oliver Dowden, has intervened and responded. This is his Twitter feed today. Ollie Robinson's tweets were offensive and wrong. They are also a decade old and written by a teenager. The teenager is now a man and has rightly apologised. The ECB has gone over the top by suspending him and should think again. So, should Ollie Robinson have been suspended from international cricket over those historic tweets? Graham?
I think probably not, Jo. And I think the fact is we need to find a way to take these things seriously, but also to accept genuine contrition. And if this young man now, but a very young man when the offensive things were published, if he's sorry, if he says that he's changed, I think we have to accept there are young people who do some silly things and say some silly things, and it mustn't stay with them and ruin their whole lives. Do
you think the ECB has overstepped the mark then?
Well, I just think there has to be a clear route back. And, you know, if they've suspended him now, we need to know what they're going to expect in order for that to come to a conclusion.
Liz, what do you think?
I take a different view from Graham, and I'm sure that there will be a route back. But look, if we want to tackle racism, misogyny, discrimination in any sport, and a governing body decides to take action around that, I think it would be, politicians would be best placed not criticising that, not just holding round tables against racism as the Culture Secretary has done, but actually when a governing body decides to take action, supporting it. Ollie's apologised himself. I'm sure there will be a route back. But if we want to stamp this out, action needs to be taken. And I think Oliver Dowden has overstepped the line himself here.
What do you think, Tim?
I think this is one of the most ridiculous stories I've ever heard. No one is the same person they were 10 years ago, and no one is the same person they were when they were a teenager. If he had done something which is a clear crime, where there's an injustice that needs to be accounted for, then fair enough. And if the judgment is that's what's happened, then OK. But when it comes to remarks that adolescents made, when they have been duly embarrassed by them, when they have apologised for them, when they have faced social sanction, which he will do because he'll live with this for many years to come, then society has to be able to forgive. And I think it was Cardinal George who once said, we've become a society where everything is permitted and nothing is forgiven. We are invited to speak our minds on Twitter. We're encouraged to say what we really think at any given moment, including when we're dumb and young. And then when people do that, they face this kind of consequence. I just think it's a bit heartless, actually.
Nadine?
I think, I think the ECB are going to have their own rules and regulations that they have to follow if there's an incident of racism. So they've probably, suspended him because that's their policy. Whether or not he should be damned in perpetuity for what he said when he was 18, I don't think he should be. But I also think there has to be a system of checks and balances when it comes to racism and a process to go through. And that's what I'm getting at the moment from what's happened. But I don't think he should be punished for it forever.
What do you think about the Culture Secretary intervening in the way he has?
I don't think it's appropriate for a culture secretary to comment on the internal management of an issue of racism within a separate sector to his. I don't think it was his place to comment on that. I
mean, Liz, how do you respond to what Tim has said, that there has to be a sort of, if you like, a statute of limitations? There has to be a recognition that these things are historic and people aren't the same 10 years on.
And I'm sure that there will be. I'm absolutely sure that there will be. There'll be a process that the ECB goes through to look at what's happened. He himself has apologised. I don't think anybody wants, him to be banned from international cricket in perpetuity. That's a ridiculous thing to suggest. But there has to be some sort of process that we go through here, because if we want to make sure that the racism that people have experienced within sport, as in other parts of society, is actually dealt with, we have to allow that due process to go ahead.
Tim, isn't that fair enough?
OK, I don't necessarily disagree with that. I just feel it is being dealt with because there is a social sanction which he has already faced. He has apologised and he will live with the humiliation of this for many years. It's probably going to set his career back. Then if there is a way forward, then, as has been suggested by others, it's for him to become an ambassador for people who have made mistakes and want to improve and to learn from the mistakes they've made. But this kind of sanction, I just come back to, I feel you've got to give kids a leeway because they say dumb things and we have a right to apologise and move on.
Nadine?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. The teenagers say stupid things. And I'll just say, as I said earlier, I think there needs to be a system where if there's an issue of a racism complaint that's raised, it has to be managed. But again, I don't think somebody should be condemned for all time for something they said when they were a teenager. All
right, well, let's leave cricket for the moment and turn to football. We're going to show you some pictures because England players have been taking the knee ahead of their recent friendly games against Romania yesterday and against Austria last Wednesday. In fact, they've been taking the knee really ever since the Black Lives Matter movement came to prominence last summer. Now, some of the fans at these matches, because they are allowed back in the stadiums now, booed the players when they took the knee. Other fans applauded them. Now, the England manager, who you can see there on the left, Gareth Southgate, has said that taking the knee is about supporting racial equality and that his team is more determined than ever to continue doing so in future matches. But let's just show our viewers, and I'll read it obviously for our guests, this reaction from a couple of Conservative MPs who've taken to Facebook to criticise the team for taking the knee. One of them, Lee Anderson, said the England football team have made a big mistake in supporting the taking of the knee before football matches ahead of the European Championships. For the first time in my life, I will not be watching my beloved England team whilst they are supporting a political movement whose core principles aim to undermine our very way of life. And this from another Conservative MP, Brendan Clark-Smith. Black Lives Matter is a political movement and also promotes some quite eccentric and extreme policies, such as abolishing the nuclear family and defunding the police. Fans are just sick and tired of being preached and spoken down to. They are there to watch a football match, not to be lectured on morality. What do you say to your colleagues, Graham?
Well, I think the problem here is that some people see taking the knee as showing allegiance to a political movement, Black Lives Matter. Other people think it's showing an objection to racism. And if you've got that situation, you've got very strongly opposing views of the same thing, it's clearly very divisive. And, football, English football, British football, has got a great record of challenging racism through other means, the Kick It Out campaign that's been going on for years in the Premier League, for instance. And there are other ways of doing this. Clearly, it's a divisive measure.
Right, but in the way that you've just said, the England manager, Gareth Southgate, says he and his players want to do this, and they want to do this for the reason you said, because they want to stamp out racism, and it's symbolically important for them. So shouldn't England fans respect their decision and politicians?
Well, I'm not very keen on booing people generally for whatever it might be. But I think it might be better to find a different way of showing a sentiment that we all share. Right.
Nadine, what do you think, reacting to these two MPs and what they've said?
I think it's part of this broader culture war. It's very disingenuous, I think, to believe that taking the knee is entirely pledging allegiance to the organisation Black Lives Matter. I mean, football players have made it clear multiple times this is because we're protesting racism. Colin Kaepernick, who kind of started off the kneeling thing, he didn't do it because he was part of the Black Lives Matter organisation. He did it to protest racism. So I think there's almost an intentionally blurring the lines to cause issues where there isn't one. And I also don't agree with the booing. I don't think people kneeling against racism should be booed.
Were you surprised, Tim, to hear that fans had been booing England players, some of them, audibly when they took the knee?
No, I'm not surprised. And one could argue that the athlete making a political statement is an exercise of their free speech. But if you do that, being booed is also an exercise of free speech in response. You take a risk whenever you make a political statement. And even if it's a statement that almost everyone would agree with, opposition to racism in sport, you're going to provoke a reaction. So make the statement, but I think you also probably have to accept when you do that, that there's going to be a statement in reply. And that seems to be what's happening. Some people seem to think, oh, you can keep sport completely free of politics. I don't think almost anything, particularly in 2021, is free of politics, and sport never has been. When you have Olympics held in the Third Reich, that's a political context for sport. And there is a context here, which is the problem of racism in sport. I'm just saying that if you then want to make a statement about that, don't be surprised that people make a statement in reply, be they fans or they be Tory MPs. That's what living in a democracy where we have free speech is all about.
Liz?
You know, if sports people have strong views about an issue, including political views, I think they should have the right to be able to speak out and be heard. And I think we should, you know, be backing our sports people in doing that. Again, I think that some of the responses from Conservative MPs are sort of simply fueling division, and it would be better if they didn't. Gareth Southgate was brilliant on this. He was absolutely brilliant on it. He said, we're absolutely clear where we stand as a team in supporting those players doing it. And that's really, I think it's really important, because people have experienced horrible racism in football, and they want to speak out about it and the injustices that they see, and I think they deserve our backing.
Right, Graham, are they fuelling this culture war, as Nadine calls it, these Tory MPs?
I don't know who's fueling what. It's clearly...
I mean, it was quite strident, their responses.
It was clearly a very divisive situation that arose at the match. And I was going to make a slightly different point, which is that I think it's critically important if the players are choosing to do this, or if they're being told to do it, or put in an environment where there is some pressure to do it. I'm quite happy to see players making their own free choice to make a statement, but I'm a bit uncomfortable if it starts to be something that's pressure applied and that it's almost a requirement for being part of the team.
Now, right, Liz, how do you see that particular point?
Well, I don't know where Sir Graham's evidence is that people are being pressured.
I was saying I think that's a very important question. I'd like to know the answer to it.
Right. I mean, Liz, is there a sense that it becomes almost tokenistic?
I don't think... No, I mean, that is not my understanding of this situation at all. It is people wanting to speak out about something that either has personally affected them or affected their colleagues. They want their voices to be heard on this issue. And, you know, instead of booing the team, I think we should be cheering them. That's just the bottom line.
I mean, is there a risk, Nadine, that actually it delegitimises what are, of course, important aims in terms of battles against racism, if it is seen, as you said, as a divisive measure, as something that is about culture wars, and more people start to boo? In the end, people forget what it was about in the first place.
So this is one of the broader concerns I have about when, instead of focusing on racism, we start obsessing about whether or not a football player is kneeling. What we need to remember as well is that, 75% of black people in the UK don't believe their human rights are as protected as white people's. Black women are 4 times more likely to die in childbirth in the UK than a white woman. These are key issues. So when someone takes the knee, it's about why are they taking the knee, protesting these racial injustices. And I think it's quite privileged for a lot of people to be able to sit at home and say, oh, I don't like seeing someone kneeling on television, when there are people who've got skin in the game and they're saying, look at us, recognise us, we need your help.
Right. I mean, is it ever possible to, as Tim says, to keep sport out of politics, Graham?
Not entirely, but I think it's generally a good idea to try. And it just seems to me this is clearly now escalating, where it's becoming a story of its own.
Right. Well, it's not just, of course, footballers taking the knee. Liz, I'm showing our viewers this tweet, which has the Labour leader Keir Starmer and Deputy Leader Angela Rayner. It's from last summer, and it says, "We kneel with all those opposing anti-black racism, #Black Lives Matter." Do you support them taking the knee in the way they did?
Yes, I do, showing solidarity and focusing, as Nadine said, on the issue. I mean, I think that there are some Conservative MPs who want to move it onto the culture wars area rather than dealing with the actual issue of the inequalities and injustices that exist in our society and that we need to change. I represent a very diverse constituency, one of the most diverse cities in the world. I know how important these issues are for health outcomes. Look at what's happening in COVID. People from black and minority ethnic communities far more likely to die, and the underlying reasons and causes, some of them, many of them social actually, that we have to deal with those as a country. Focus on what matters. And if you show solidarity with people to say we support you in your struggle and we're going to be part of it, then we might actually solve the problem that the footballers are kneeling about, rather than get distracted by a Twitter storm created by some Conservative MPs who want to focus on something else.
Tim?
I don't think I can disagree with much of that. I suspect in the case of those Tory MPs that if the football players had, say, whipped out a Union Jack and waved it around, they'd have said, "Too right, too." This is the thing about culture wars. People object to the thing they don't like or disagree with. It's not just an objection to politics and sport. It's an objection to a politics you disagree with in sport, because the culture wars is, of course, like so many things in life, a battle about power. Personally, I'm just sick of politics. Now, I'm a pundit. So
don't say that on this show, please.
It's like a bus driver complaining about traffic, but it is true. I am sick of the invasion of politics into every single sphere of everyday life. So I'm torn, because I see a bit of hypocrisy in people saying there should be absolutely no politics in sport, when I suspect they'd be all for a politics they agreed with. But on the other hand, I'd like to go for a day of my life without having to be sucked into some culture war battle. I'd just like to watch something or enjoy something and just have a nice time.
Well, we're all about trying to have a nice time, Tim, if we can provide it.
Liz? Just very briefly, I think Tim has actually really hit on something very, very important, which is the feeling or sense of divisiveness, which has been around and growing for many years, and that it sometimes feels like we're a country not at ease with ourselves. And that is a really important issue. We've seen it over Brexit. We often see it over debates about COVID and the restrictions and should they be followed or not followed. And I think that is a bad place for a country to be. And we need our national leaders actually to trying to bring us together rather than always trying to, double down and force the country apart. Because it's like in a family. If you've got that divisiveness within a family, it's not at ease with itself, and nobody really wants to be in that place.
All right, well, Liz, you mentioned COVID restrictions. Let's talk about that, because the regulator here has approved the use of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine in children aged 12 to 15. There was already approval for older children. It's now up to the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation to advise the government if and when children should be part of the vaccine rollout. Let's talk to Adam Finn, who is Professor of Paediatrics at Bristol University and a member of the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation. Adam, I've heard you talk about this quite a lot. I know there is a decision to be made, but is it right to vaccinate kids who are at very low risk from COVID?
Well, no, it isn't. It would be right to immunise children if they are going to benefit from it. And there will be some children, of course, who are at high risk of COVID and do need to be immunised without question, although there is a need to identify exactly who they are. But for generalised immunisation, I think we all feel there needs to be some definable benefit. Now, the biggest harm that children have experienced during this pandemic is the disruption of their education. And I think if it proves necessary to immunise children to avoid that happening further, that becomes a very compelling argument for doing it. But it's not very clear at this point whether or not that is a risk.
So what's going to tip the balance for you, Adam, as you think about it?
Well, it'll be me and many others, but we need to see what's going to go on with the epidemiology as the adult programme moves forward and with this new variant emerging as well. There's clear evidence from Israel, for example, that by immunising a sufficiently high proportion of adults with the vaccine, you can actually eliminate the infection in children without immunising them at all. And if that proves to be the situation we find ourselves in, then there wouldn't be any justification for immunising children who weren't at any risk at all. On the other hand, if we have a variant that's emerging and is going to cause outbreaks in schools and disrupt education, is going to cause outbreaks or children being excluded, that's another matter entirely.
Right, but Adam, at the moment, it sounds like this is less for their own protection in terms of younger children on balance and more a benefit for the wider population.
Well, I think preventing disruption to education is a direct benefit for children, even if it's due to outbreaks that are not particularly making them very ill. We've seen schools shut down repeatedly now, even though children haven't been getting sick in very large numbers. And certainly since they reopened around Easter time, we've not really seen the numbers of cases in children going up significantly at all. So it's an open question, but we are in a moving situation and it's very hard to nail down.
We are going to be talking about the relaxation of restrictions, Freedom Day, as some people are calling it, on the 21st of June. Do you think we'll be ready for that at that date?
Well, again, it is very much the same uncertainties that we're faced with at the moment. We are seeing numbers of cases going up, as we predicted and expected once the restrictions on people's contact were begun to be removed. And the real question is whether they're going to go up much faster than predicted, and in particular, whether they're going to lead to significant numbers of severe cases and hospitalizations. And it's really a bit too soon to say with any confidence. The trends are quite concerning, but they are still relatively small numbers.
Adam Finn, thank you very much. Graham, let's go back to this question about vaccinating children. Should we be doing it?
I'm very uneasy about it. I thought Professor Finn put the dilemma very well, and the question of whether you're talking about the whole population of children or just children who are particularly vulnerable, I think, is a key one. I'm very uneasy at the idea that you might give a vaccine to a child, not for the benefit of the child itself, and knowing that there is some risk associated with the vaccine. We know the risks are quite small, or they appear to be, but we do know there's been some problems with blood clotting from the AstraZeneca. We know there's some evidence from Israel of some heart problems from young men in particular, who've had the Pfizer vaccine. I think we should go very, very carefully.
Tim?
I'm surprised to hear all of that, actually. I didn't realise that there was that there were so many concerns. I do know people who have said to me, I'm reluctant to have my child get it because they feel that on balance, the risks from having the vaccine and those side effects is greater than the disease itself. So these conversations are taking place, but I'm rather surprised by them. I thought there was a high degree of confidence in the vaccine, and I don't see why children shouldn't get it.
Nadine?
So I'm concerned about younger people being vaccinated here in so much that other countries just don't have the access to the vaccines that we have. So we know that children are quite low risk when it comes to COVID being dangerous to them. But meanwhile, I think it's 1% of Africa has been vaccinated so far with the vaccine against COVID. So my issue comes from, I think we should be prioritising high-risk people in countries that just don't have anywhere near the level of immunity that we have.
Do you agree with that, Liz?
I don't think it's an either-or. I don't think it's a choice between vaccinating, if that's what the JCVI recommends children in this country, and doing far, far more to vaccinate the rest of the world. That is not what the question is. And I think clearly
it could be, Liz. I mean, are you saying that there are enough vaccinations for everyone?
Except, I mean, obviously, it's not being proposed to provide the AstraZeneca vaccine to children above 12. We're absolutely able to do more to get the production of that up and out to other countries, because, you know, if we don't do that, we're going to keep on seeing new variants. But let me just say this. I think the most important point that Adam said, and of course there are ethical considerations. Children do get it much more mildly than other people and can get long COVID. But for me, the absolute worst thing to have come out of this pandemic, on top of the health issues and the deaths that we've seen, is children missing out on schools. And we cannot risk our children and young people missing out on any more school. Children from the poorest backgrounds have really suffered from not being in school. And I think that is really one of the strongest arguments in favour. And I'm sure that the JCVI will look at that.
Graham?
Well, we'll be looking very soon at a situation where the vast majority of teachers and support staff in schools will have been vaccinated. So that should greatly lessen any risk to them. We know that the children are far less likely to get COVID. We know they're less likely to have severe symptoms. And yes, there is a concern about long COVID, but I think the evidence suggests that if children do get it, they get it less badly and not for as long.
Right. I mean, Tim, again, to come back to this issue about, I suppose, around the safety, I'm not asking you to give your opinion on that, but you said you were surprised that there are concerns. Is there also a concern around prioritising vaccinations either here to younger children or, as Nadine was saying, sending them abroad to more vulnerable people, older people in parts of the world that haven't been vaccinated very highly?
Yes, we're not entirely sure what the numbers are on the amount of doses that are available to the UK. And we know the UK has ordered around 400 million, which is far more than the UK needs. So in theory, it could share some of that supply with the rest of the world. And it should be doing that through COVAX, not just financial donations. And I think Liz is right. It doesn't have to be an either or. It could actually be both. And the UK, of course, would respond by saying, well, we have made sure that AstraZeneca is supplied to the rest of the world at cost. We have donated money towards COVAX. We have invested in upscaling manufacturing. Britain has done its part. But it's probably going to have to do more. And at some point, the ethical question will have to be asked. What matters? Vaccinating kids or vaccinating people overseas? What is your sense of your priority? And it could be that we're moving to the stage of the virus where... Oh, gosh. Oh, sorry.
It was you. Everyone suddenly looked down because everybody felt guilty. I'm glad it was you, Tim.
I thought I'd lost contact and said someone's just ringing me on the phone.
You're still with us.
It's a big ethical dilemma. We're going to have to confront it. But, of course, the Prime Minister is going to use the G7 to say that he wants to see the entire world vaccinated by the end of 2022. So I think we are going to see action on this. And I agree with Liz. It's probably not a case of a choice. It's not an either or. We probably can do both. Right.
Graham, on that, actually, since Tim's brought it up, vaccinating the whole world by the end of next year, ambitious?
It's certainly ambitious. I mean, I guess we'd have to say that...
Is it possible?
I don't know whether it's possible, but I would say we were very ambitious about getting the vaccine ready and available in this country.
Yeah, the whole world is slightly different, though, isn't it?
In fulfilling that ambition.
Right.
But let's be ambitious.
All right, well, let me just show you. I mean, first of all, we've got this headline here in The Guardian, which is picking up on what we've been talking about, which is vaccinate vulnerable global poor before children in rich countries, so say the World Health Organization. But I want to show you a couple of graphs, because this is about the increase in cases. You can see here COVID-19 cases last month. It's been a significant increase. 7-day average is now over 4,500. But to put it in some context over the whole period of the pandemic, we can show you another graph where you can see, although it has gone up, it is far, far lower than the two peaks. But taking that into consideration, Graham, does that mean that June 21st date is at risk?
I very much hope not. I think we are in a position which is much better than any of the scenarios that were mapped out at the start of the so-called roadmap as to where we would be now. So clearly there's been an increase in the number of positive test results. There's been a small increase in the number of people going to hospital, but it's dramatically different from the picture that we had earlier in the pandemic. And clearly the vaccines are having a very important effect in suppressing the spread of COVID.
Do you think the 21st of June now looks like a far-off dream?
I don't necessarily think it's a far-off dream, but I do think it's probably going to be pushed back. And I just think it's because we're in a pandemic where there's so many unknowns. I mean, we had several waves. We weren't sure how it's going to play out. We were warned. Scientists said we may have to delay reopening. We may need to have a fire break. If scientists are starting to kind of, gesture towards, we're probably going to have to push it back. After how many over a year into the pandemic, I'm inclined to believe them. And so I do think we're probably going to have to push it back by a few weeks.
Tim, do you agree, or do you think the government is going to stick to June the 21st, despite the data here showing an increase in cases? Graham is right. The hospitalisations, according to Matt Hancock, have remained pretty flat, and those who are in hospital, most of them haven't been vaccinated, or it's not fully vaccinated anyway.
The government is going to do its best to stick to June 21 for economic reasons, for political reasons, and also for health reasons, because it's not healthy to remain locked down for much longer. But the key question is, what is its metric? The government says its metric for whether or not to open up is not cases, it's hospitalizations. And in theory, you should be able to endure a certain rise in cases so long as they don't result in severe illness. You should be able to learn to live with that. Because after all, government has said throughout this that if at some point in the future, we will have to learn to live with COVID, that it'll be like a seasonal disease that we respond to every year, but we won't keep on shutting down. When are we going to hit that point? Well, if it is true that something like 70% of us in England have antibodies in our system, you could argue we're already reaching herd immunity, in which case there is, right now, looking at the evidence we have right now, no compelling reason not to stick to the June 21 deadline.
Should it be delayed or stuck to, Liz?
I mean, I'm sorry to be cliche, but it's got to be driven by the data, not the dates.
But which data? Because we're trying to, aren't we, distinguish between the number of cases and whether it's about hospitalisations.
And it's good news that the hospitalisations haven't taken off as some might have expected, even though the infection rates are rising. Look, like Sir Graham and everybody else, I am desperate for everything to get back to as normal as possible and for the final restrictions to be moved. But we need to take a cautious approach here. We have got to do even more, I think, to encourage people to take up their second vaccines. That's a really important thing the government should be focusing on. Well, secondly, there's to still, if I can say this, Jo, because it's, a city like mine, which has been virtually in lockdown the whole time, and still has, our rates aren't as high as they have been, but we've still got some fundamental things the government hasn't fixed, like extra support, financial support for people to self-isolate. People don't even want to take a test in case it's found to be positive, then they can't go to work and then they can't pay the bills. So there are still some big things the government could sort out now to put us in an even better position than the NHS has put us in with the brilliant vaccination programme. If you look at countries like Israel, who seem to really have kept on top of infections and been able to squash down new variants, they're still a little way ahead of us, even though the NHS's programme here has been brilliant. And that is how they've managed to go slowly, steadily, but by boosting the double vaccination figure. And that's where the government is focusing.
Graham, will you oppose any government move to extend the restrictions?
I think unless there were some compelling evidence. I think this roadmap, so-called, has been a very slow one. We've had very long gaps between each stage. At each point of the opening up, we've seen actually there hasn't been a significant problem from opening schools, from outdoor hospitality, from indoor hospitality. We're not having a serious problem. And, I think the crucial point that was being made, I think, by Tim earlier, we do have to find a way of living with this. There will be new variants of this, which will crop up every week, every month, every year, whatever it might be. And we can't always respond by closing down.
Right. Well, David King, the government's former chief scientific advisor, has said that a delay to the reopening should be announced without delay. A few weeks delay and see how the figures are emerging.
Well, as I said earlier, we are in a better place than any of the scenarios that were mapped out at the start of this process. So on that basis, we ought to be proceeding. We've got to think about the real human consequences of this. I'd say even at a relatively trivial level, perhaps, or other people might take a different view. A young woman who used to work for me has now rearranged her wedding for the third time to the 3rd of July. a 2-week extension and should be cancelling it for the third time. And there must be many, many hundreds of thousands of people in those kind of situations.
Right, but is there anything you and your colleagues can do?
Well, I think it's important that we give the Prime Minister the support in sticking to the roadmap that he's set out now. We try to make sure that people are conscious of the data. They're conscious that it has been better than anybody expected it to be.
But you can't, so in principle, you can't actually stop a change, an extension, can you?
I think there would have to be a vote at some point. I'm not sure that it would have to be a vote before the 21st of June or not.
Right, because you've rebelled against government policy on lockdown and travel restrictions in the past. Is that still compatible with your role as chairman of the 1922 committee of backbench Tory MPs?
That will be a matter for my colleagues to decide, and they'll have an opportunity in a couple of weeks' time when we have an election for that. What I would say is that I think being chairman of the 1922 committee doesn't absolve you of having a responsibility as a member of Parliament as well. We've had one of the most fundamental changes of policy driven by the pandemic. We've had fundamental freedoms taken away from people, things like a legal ban on seeing your children or grandchildren. I think for me to have remained silent through that would have been entirely wrong.
Right, well, on that, what's your reaction then to this story in the Times? I'm just showing our viewers front bench backing for Sir Graham Brady's 1922 rival. Robert Goodwill, what do you say?
Well, I would say the people they cited were parliamentary private secretaries. I think I have a very good relationship with the Prime Minister and with the front bench.
All right. We're going to leave it there and we're going to talk about international aid because the government is facing a possible Commons defeat. It's first, actually, after cutting spending of national income on international aid from 0.7% to 0.5% of national income. Let's have a listen to the Tory MP, David Davis.
If you are a small child and you then suddenly get dirty water and you get an infection from it and you die, temporary doesn't mean much. I think in this year, what we need to look at, so limited to 1 year, as you say, but in this year I would look and say, you've just got to have a very close look at the damage that you're doing. If you are going to kill people with this, which I think is going to be the outcome in many areas, we need to reverse those immediately.
Let's talk to our political correspondent, Damien Grammaticas. Damien, just tell us all exactly what's happening this afternoon.
Well, both sides are waiting to see if the amendment that the rebels have want to table will be selected by the Speaker's office, and they could hear in the next hour or so. What the rebel side say is that they simply have lost patience. They say this was announced a year ago, or 6 months ago, at the end of last year, these cuts. They have given time, but they do not believe that there is a proper legal basis for this, certainly if the cuts were ongoing into next year. Those letters to charities, aid organisations are going out now. So there are development organisations, girls' education in Bangladesh having their funding they were expecting cut, things like food aid to Yemen, polio eradication cut by 95%. What the rebels say is that this has been untransparent. The overall figures haven't come out. They have lost patience. They want this amendment today. The government says that, well, these are temporary cuts brought on by pressure on public spending, and they all wait to hear whether this will go forward this afternoon.
Damien, thank you. Graham, we just heard David Davis saying, their former minister, that a cut to the aid budget would kill people. Is that the way you and your constituents see it?
Obviously, it's a very dramatic way of putting it. I mean, I guess that would be an argument for spending most of our GDP on foreign aid, and you could save even more lives. So, of course, these are difficult decisions, they're difficult balances, but we have got the most extraordinary situation in the public finances. A huge amount of public debt that has been accumulated over the last year or more. And I don't think it's unreasonable to say that we are going to have a temporary small reduction in what is one of the biggest aid budgets in the world still.
Liz?
Look, put to one side the moral questionability of cutting funding for projects that give children clean water or help young girls go to school or stop women dying in childbirth. Put that to one side. I think this is a colossal mistake for Boris Johnson to make on his own terms. He says he wants post-Brexit to see global Britain, and yet our soft influence and power is really affected by things like our aid spending, where in the past we have led the way. But I also think it's in our self-interest, it's in the interests of Graham Brady's constituents and my constituents that we provide funding for projects. I mean, just look at the COVID pandemic. Shows more than ever before that what happens in other countries can affect us here. So I think for both the moral reasons, but also our own self-interest and Johnson's stated goal, it's a really big mistake, and he needs to change course.
Tim?
Almost no one, apart from a few libertarians, are against free aid, foreign aid in principle. The question is, should a country, through thick and thin, be committed by law to spending a specific amount of its budget on foreign aid? And since 2015, we've been committed by David Cameron to spending 0.7%, which is the UN's goal. And the consequence of that, the argument against it, is that it means that you start to measure success on the basis of how much you spent rather than what the results are. So there is, in other words, there is an argument against the 0.7% figure, which is bigger and philosophical rather than just the temporary question of these specific cuts. And I think that's what's being fought over here. Plus, you've got to remember that the government is going to end up cutting some things. This is regarded as the first and easiest of the cuts to make because it's overwhelmingly popular with the public. There was a poll from last year that found that 92% of Conservative supporters support cutting foreign aid. So they thought this would be a very straightforward one to do, and they faced a significant rebellion and may well lose on it. What does that say about fiscal policy down the road? If the government can't even cut a programme that is wildly unpopular and for which it feels it should have natural backing of its backbenchers, if it can't even cut that, what in the future can it cut to balance the books? So this isn't just about foreign aid. This is about the government's control over its ability to set fiscal policy.
Nadine?
So correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the 0.7% foreign aid was in the Conservative manifesto. So it was a manifesto pledge that Conservative voters voted for. I would also say, you know, the reason it's a percentage of GDP, it means it shrinks if the economy shrinks and vice versa. So it's not a set amount of money. It will shrink if we're...
No, it's a percentage of it.
Yeah. And also just more broadly, the ethical arguments. A lot of the countries that we provide foreign aid to were former colonies or Britain benefited from during colonialism. We have a historic debt to these countries. A lot of the kind of poverty and inequality is a legacy of the exploitation that happened during empire. To pull this funding away now, particularly during a pandemic in some of the most vulnerable communities in the world when they're suffering the most, for me, I just find morally reprehensible.
It was in the, and is, in the election manifesto.
Well, an awful lot of what we've been doing over the last 15 months was not in the election manifesto. The £407 billion of additional expenditure over the last 15 months in response to COVID was not in the manifesto. So in extraordinary times, with extraordinary pressures on the public finances, I don't think it's unreasonable to make a small adjustment in the overseas aid budget.
Right. Would you do that with something like the triple lock, for example, also expensive, arguably, also in the manifesto?
Well, that, of course, is another debate, and it's an ongoing debate. Clearly, there are pressures on the public finances, and as Tim was saying, it is going to be necessary to tighten the government's belt at some point in some way. This is one relatively small instance of it.
Right. What do you say, Nadine, to the popularity, as it seems, amongst British voters? The YouGov poll in November suggesting the public is with the government on this. It was 2/3 supporting a cut to the aid budget. Are they wrong, the British public? I
mean, I disagree with whoever is saying that they think we should cut foreign aid. I mean, I think that's clear from the arguments I've made. But again, you know, irrespective of whether it's popular with the public, there were manifesto pledges made. So people did vote a manifesto in on the basis that foreign aid would be up to.
Isn't it an issue of public trust when it comes to the manifesto?
I really don't think it is in this instance, in these circumstances. We've been dealing with the most unpredictable crisis. And it has meant extreme responses, which include the expenditure of a vast amount of money in supporting the domestic economy, supporting businesses, supporting jobs, all things which have had to be done in the context of the lockdowns we've had.
Briefly, Liz, because we're coming to the end of the programme.
You know, I completely agree with Nadine on the moral arguments, but I think the arguments about Britain's influence in the world, not only in the countries where we spend the money, but with our international allies, America's increasing its funding on aid, so is France, so is Germany, but also our self-interest. And I think it's all a matter of how you view the world.
All right, I'm going to stop you there because we're at the end of the programme. From all of us here, though, thank you very much and goodbye.